Hello everyone, welcome to History and Culture. The ancient saying goes, without rules, there can be no square or circle. As early as the tribal period of primitive Chinese society, many basic rules and systems began to take shape. For instance, how to allocate production materials, how to distribute surplus wealth, and how to select heirs, these were all regulated by certain rules and systems. Over time, these rules evolved into a more complete legal framework as society developed. With the arrival of the feudal society, in order to maintain order, a basic legal framework gradually took shape. If someone violated these laws, depending on the severity of the crime, they would often face corresponding punishments. Minor punishments could involve fines or exile, while the most severe punishment was the death penalty. According to historical records, in ancient times, many prisoners sentenced to death were usually given a last meal before their execution. This meal was very different from their usual food. It was not only rich in color, aroma, and flavor, with a combination of meat and vegetables, but might also include some alcohol, satisfying the last requests of the condemned. This relatively lavish meal was also called the head-chopping meal. On one hand, the head-chopping meal symbolized the last meal of a death row prisoner and served as an attempt, from a spiritual perspective, to alleviate the anger or resentment of the condemned. On the other hand, the special feature of this meal was that it often contained a piece of spoiled raw meat. Although this raw, decayed meat often emitted a foul odor, there is still confusion about its significance. What exactly did this piece of raw meat mean? Some historians have analyzed that the first reason behind this practice involves an unspoken act of corruption. According to the regulations in many dynasties, the last meal must include both meat and vegetables, since meat was usually more expensive. In order to satisfy the death row prisoners' need for meat, more funds were often allocated for this purpose. However, in many cases, this money was not fully used for the meal but was instead embezzled by the officials in charge of carrying out the executions. Although these officials benefited from this, they had to do so discreetly to avoid being held accountable. To prevent suspicion, they would ensure the meal included both meat and vegetables, while secretly cutting corners. Raw meat was the cheapest type of meat, and since death row prisoners typically would not eat raw meat, it gave officials the opportunity to recycle it. Typically, the executing officials would keep the raw meat and use it in the next condemned prisoner's last meal. This not only saved some funds, but since the prisoner was about to be executed, they usually didn't mind or report the exploitation. Over time, the raw meat could become moldy or rotten, but it still became a sign of corruption among the officials. The second reason relates to the ancient people's beliefs and customs. Ancient people believed that only the living ate cooked meat, while the dead could only eat raw meat. Especially in ancient Chinese society, where people were very fearful of ghosts and spirits, raw meat was often offered as a sacrifice to deities during seasonal rites. In the ancient mindset, the deceased were revered. Preparing a piece of raw meat for a death row prisoner was, in some sense, like a sacrificial offering. It symbolized an attempt to soothe and guide the soul of the deceased. Ancient people believed that those sentenced to death often died violently, which caused their souls to lose direction and be unable to smoothly enter the afterlife. The raw meat, in their view, symbolized a guide to lead the soul to the underworld, preventing it from getting lost in the human world. The raw meat was also seen as a pass that helped the deceased soul pass through the underworld smoothly. According to ancient belief systems, once the soul left the body, if it lacked proper guidance, it could be led to an unfortunate end by the black and white impermanents, deities who guide souls, or even be devoured by the hellish hounds. The raw meat was believed to be a special item that could ward off the hellish dogs and protect the soul from harm. Thus, the raw meat represented a connection between the living and the dead. and also reflected the ancient people's deep concern for the peace of the soul. While some officials may have exploited this practice for personal gain due to the cheapness of the meat, its more significant meaning lies in its place within ancient belief systems. It was considered an essential item for ensuring the soul's eternal rest. It is worth mentioning that the evolution of the death penalty in ancient China is closely related to the stages of social development. The social structure, legal system, and the rulers' governing philosophy in different historical periods have all had a significant impact on the application of the death penalty. During the Qin Dynasty, in the era of slavery, the use of the death penalty was relatively widespread. At this time, with the emergence and competition for private property, the state began to take shape. To ensure the stability of the regime, any challenge to the ruling authority was severely punished. Many ancient texts mention that those who disobeyed orders would face harsh punishments. The death penalty during the Qin Dynasty was varied and continuously increasing. In the Shang Dynasty, the application of the death penalty became even more frequent, especially under the rule of tyrants. The death penalty was not only used to punish crimes but also became a tool for the king's amusement. Many people lost their lives in endless suffering. It wasn't until the Western Zhou period that some legal reforms began to take place. One of the most important reforms was to reduce the types and scope of the death penalty. However, in slave society, punishments often varied according to the identity and status of the offender. Due to the hierarchical system in ancient Chinese society, this inequality did not fundamentally change in the subsequent feudal society. In the early feudal periods of the Qin and Han dynasties, the death penalty remained an important part of the legal system, and crimes were numerous. During this period, although the system of slavery had been overthrown, many cruel punishments were still retained, especially under the Qin Dynasty. The Qin Dynasty adopted legalist philosophy for governance, emphasizing the deterrent effect of centralized power, and the death penalty became a crucial tool for state governance. The types of death penalties in the Qin Dynasty were numerous, including beheading, breaking on the wheel, live burial, and drowning, with as many as 19 forms. However, this harsh penal system also became one of the important factors contributing to the fall of the Qin Dynasty, as excessive and severe laws not only failed to unite the people but also intensified social unrest. In the subsequent three kingdoms, Jin dynasties, and the northern and southern dynasties, the fragmentation of state power, social instability, and constant warfare prevailed. According to legal documents from the time, although the death penalty still existed, its frequency and cruelty were reduced compared to the Qin and Han periods. The death penalty was no longer a common form of punishment, and the law gradually became more rational. During the Sui and Tang dynasties, the death penalty system in China was relatively lenient compared to earlier periods. The concept of transforming death into life and substituting light penalties for heavy ones was promoted, which led to a significant reduction in the scope and types of crimes punishable by death. The relevant procedures also became more refined. In the Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties, as feudal society gradually developed, specialized judicial institutions were established, and death penalty rulings became more cautious. The classification of crimes became more detailed. In the late Qing dynasty, there was a fundamental change in the death penalty system, and there was a public movement calling for the reduction of death sentences. However, despite the continuous calls to reduce the death penalty, it remained an important part of the legal system as the highest form of punishment, serving to ensure the authority of the law. According to some historians, as revealed by the evolution of the ancient death penalty system and the implied meaning behind head-chopping rice, only through the gradual establishment of a just and transparent legal system can social harmony and civil progress be truly achieved, ensuring that the rights of every individual are protected and social justice is realized. This is the History and Culture channel. Liking and subscribing are the greatest help and support to us. Thank you everyone and see you in the next time.